Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Jim Zwack. I'm from the Davey Institute. I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then we'll dive into a number of things. I think Mark's talk was outstanding. It sets up a lot of things that I'll talk about. I'm not going to get into the biology and the life cycle and all. He covered that really well. I am going to expand on a couple of the topics that he started to talk about, and hopefully I'll help answer some of the questions about how do you get traction, how do you get movement, how does that look. I'll share some examples of what we've seen. In the way of just a short personal introduction about myself, my background is in urban forestry and tree physiology. I am from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I spent 1 year doing applied research after graduate school at the University of Minnesota Landscape Arboretum. And then I worked for a company in the Twin Cities called Rainbow Tree Care Scientific Advancements for about 10 years. We sold products to arborists and tree care companies across the country, mostly related to plant health care, insecticides, fungicides, things for Dutch elm disease, emerald ash borer, and so on. And I've been with the Davey Tree Expert Company for a little over 3 years now. I work in a part of the organization called the Davey Institute. This is more the research and the technical arm of Davey. I oversee our technical staff. There's about 10 of us in my group. We're scattered around the country. About half of my staff is based in Kent, Ohio, where Davey is headquartered. The other half are in Florida, California, Milwaukee, Chicago, and I'm in Minneapolis myself. It's really nice to be here today. My wife's very upset. Twin Cities is in a winter storm warning today. We're getting 6 to 10 inches of snow. She swears every time I leave town it snows between the months of December and April, and she's actually usually right about that. I leave again on Sunday, and that's when they're saying it's going to snow again. So it's really good to be here. I'll be in a lot of trouble when I get home, and you don't have to worry about that. I'll deal with that part myself. The theme, if you will, for where my portion of today's seminar and workshop will go has to do with this sentiment, this idea that if we can't remember the past, we're condemned to repeat it. It's a quote often given credit to this George Santayana, the author and philosopher. But the point is, as gloom and doom as emerald ash borer is, and it is the real deal, we're lucky here. We're fortunate. And it might sound strange to hear me say it that way, but we're very lucky that we weren't Detroit or Toledo or some of these other places I'll share their stories about. We have the ability to learn from what others have done. And that's what I'll try to share with you today. What have others done? How's it looked? Why are we doing what we're doing? How does it look? So that you can benefit from that collective body of knowledge. You don't have to go through it all yourselves. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. So hopefully, if we're successful over the course of the day, that will become apparent. So here's how I'm going to approach my portion of the talk. I'll bring all 4 of these bullets up at the same time. I like to put a little agenda up here. We'll see this slide a couple more times as we transition through this. But I'll start off by talking about emerald ash borer at this population level. And Mark referred to some things, that the EAB mortality curve, that death curve. I'll expand upon that a little bit. We'll talk briefly about why this is a problem we have to manage. And then we'll get into how do we do it. What are people out there doing? What are some specific examples of how this looks? And that's how we'll proceed. So without any further ado, we'll go right into emerald ash borer at a population level. And so what do I mean by this? Well, we've established that this, we know, is an exotic invasive pest. It was first identified in 2002. It had probably been in North America for 10 years prior to that. Detroit and Windsor were sort of ground zero. It's killed tens of millions of trees, probably at this point, fair to say, 100 million trees or more. It's already on scale with Dutch elm disease in terms of tree mortality. And we've only known about it since 2002. We're going to measure the overall financial impact of this in billions of dollars. That's going to be the case. And that's my only slide that I have here as well. Mark showed you the map, and he showed you how it progressed over time. And I like that a lot. And I've actually kind of have a derivation of that I have coming up here in a few more slides. But this has been on the move since it came into this country and came in the Detroit-Windsor area, right in that area there. And it's just moving out in all directions, kind of like throwing a rock into a calm pond. The ripple is moving in all directions. I tell you what, this jump right here, Colorado, they found it in Boulder in early October. And that was about 600 miles further west than the previous known infestation. That's a big jump. I live in Minneapolis. We found it in 2009. The closest to Minneapolis that it was before we found it was down here, about 150 miles away. So clearly it's making big leaps and big jumps. But this finding out in Colorado caught people off guard. Nobody expected it would make such a big leap that way. And it's happening because of us. It's also, where's Mark? It's my favorite emerald ash borer cartoon as well. And so we're part of the problem. We're moving this thing around. It can fly on its own. We understand that. We've learned that from what Mark had to say. But it's people, it's firewood, it's packing material. We're part of the problem. There's no question about it. If you talk to Scott Shermer, who is the state EAB coordinator for the state of Illinois, he'll tell you all of their downstate findings, south of Chicago, every new infestation they're finding in Illinois, south of Chicago, is within 2 or 3 miles of an interstate highway corridor. That's just the way it is. We're moving it around. In Minneapolis, St. Paul, where we found it, right at the junction of 2 major interstate highways, right in the middle of the Twin Cities. So without question, we're part of the problem. The insect has its own skills and capabilities and can get around on its own pretty well, and then we do everything we can to support it. So where Mark showed you the map with the dots on it, I think in terms of emerald ash borer as being sort of like a storm. In urban forestry and arboriculture, we hear about storms, we hear about hurricanes, we deal with these kinds of things, the mobilization of crews and so on and so forth. I think emerald ash borer is a new kind of storm. It's centered on Detroit, Windsor, and it's just getting bigger and bigger. And if you think about this, it's sort of an analogy that works. In Detroit now, Windsor now, most of the ash trees are gone. The action is just, it's sort of like the eye of the hurricane, right? The winds aren't strongest out at the eye of the hurricane or in that eye itself. It's sort of all over except for a little bit of shouting. But out here where we're at, where I'm at in Minneapolis, and now I suppose I probably need to make this bigger because it's in Colorado, that's where the action's at. And that's where the action is going to be at. But it takes a little bit of time. And that's one of the inherent challenges with dealing with this particular pest. This mortality curve, I will revisit. This will become sort of a core tenet of my talk. It's a critically important piece of information to understand. And I will revisit this, but the way this works, and as Mark already explained, this is based on Dan Herm's data. And the reality of all this is, after you find the emerald ash borer, you don't have hundreds and thousands of dead and dying trees all of the sudden. Several years, multiple years may go by before you start to really feel the effects. And I have another slide coming up that I'll illustrate what I mean by this, but I think this is part of the emerald ash borer trap. It lulls us into a false sense of security or complacency. When you found it and 3 or 4 or 5 years have gone by and you don't have hundreds or thousands of dead and dying ash trees, the kinds of questions people ask are things like, what's all the noise about? What's all the talk about? This isn't so bad. What do you mean, emerald ash borer? We've had it for 5 years. It's not so bad. Maybe it'll be different here. Maybe where we're at is different than all those other places. Maybe it won't be so bad. This is what creeps in. It's sort of insidious to think this way in this period of time. But what the data shows, and what's repeated itself over and over and over again across the country, is that there will come a time where you get up and there's an uptick and the pest population has built. And the real trick to emerald ash borer is that there will come this window where 2/3 to 3/4 of your ash population will die in a 3 to 5 year window of time. That's what makes this so different and so much more damaging and so much more challenging to manage than a lot of other problems. So what you have over here is thinking about at a population level, what percentage of the ash population is dead. And so up here it says 100. By the time 15 years have gone by since you found it, essentially all of the ash in the area are gone. So when you're in this steep part of this curve right here, that's when you'll see 25% of all of your ash trees dying in 1 year. And you'll have that multiple years in a row. That's the problem. And that's where, if you have a lot of ash trees that you manage, that's, as Mark says, that's where the do-nothing approach really hurts you, right out here. So you've got to be doing things down here in order to flatten that curve off. So that's I think, a critically important bit of information. And we'll revisit this one a few more times. So we'll hit that one up front and we'll come back and we'll deal with it again and again. So I'll ask the question, why do we have to manage emerald ash borer? And my previous slide probably shined a little bit of light on that, and in part because if you've got a lot of ash trees to deal with, when you get to that steep part of the curve, you can get in a lot of trouble. If you take a different problem, like say Dutch elm disease was, bad as that problem was, that gets, in Minneapolis where I live, that gets anywhere from 5% of the elms a year up to, heavy year, maybe 10%, 11, 12% of the elms. And there's an ebb and a flow. And it picks off a percentage of the population each year. And so the population of elms that remain goes down. But we don't have it showing up any longer the way that emerald ash borer is. And this pattern has been very predictable. So why manage this? Well, not to step on the toes of speakers coming this afternoon, I just have one reference to this, or actually I think I have two. The Society of Municipal Arborists put out a position paper on emerald ash borer that says failing to plan puts you on a road to disaster. If you have a lot of ash trees and you decide to do nothing about it and just wait, it's not going to be a good recipe for you in the long run. Well, I can compartmentalize the why we have to deal with this and why we have to create urgency or why we have to manage this problem into 4 different distinct reasons. The scope of the problem, liability and risk, the benefit loss, and the economics of all this. This is, in my opinion, it's a tree problem, but emerald ash borer is a risk, liability, and economic problem as much as it is a tree problem. So, the gentleman here who asked the question about how do you get traction, part of the answer to that to me is you reframe the conversation with decision makers who control dollars and cents and budgets, and you reframe this away from just being a tree problem, but into economics and risk because of the realities of that. And I'll share with you the specific examples other people have gone through. So it's every bit as much all of these other things. Here's why. Scope of the problem. Why do we have to manage the emerald ash borer? Why can't we just let this happen? Why is this different than anything else that we have to deal with? I mean, after all, we're busy people, lots of trees, lots of problems, storms are unpredictable. Well, they're prevalent species. Denver, Colorado, they just found it in Boulder. Boulder itself has 90,000 ash trees, so you get a sense of scope. Denver estimates they have 15 to 20% of their canopy is ash. Milwaukee's number is 17% ash. Where I live in Minneapolis, St. Paul, 20% is a number we toss around a lot, and in places, much, much higher. A lot of the small towns in the Midwest, you'll see 30, 40, 50, up to 60% of their trees are ash. It's a tough tree. Grows in a lot of places. You can abuse it. Does really well under a lot of hard conditions, except for this particular problem. What you see in the 2 images there is from Toledo, Ohio. On the left, that's 2006 on Belvedere Street, and on the right, 2009. It's a 3-year difference in time. So to go from no apparent problems, I don't understand what all the problem or what all the commotion about EAB is all about. Look, we're fine, to essentially stone cold dead ash trees in a period of 3 years. Think about that curve. Think about where they might have been at this point in time and where they are 3 seasons later. So the scope of the problem is one reason alone. If you've got a lot of ash trees, it's just going to be a big problem. The sheer numbers of it dictate it that way. Let's talk a little bit about risk and liability. What about that? Well, it turns out that trees that become infested with EAB are different than other kinds of ash trees out there. They behave differently. They become a bit unpredictable. They get dry. As Mark walked through how the pest actually works inside the tree, these things get dry. They get brittle. The vascular tissue gets disrupted. We have canopy thinning, we have dieback, and they don't behave just sort of like a regular old dead tree, if you will. They have more cracking. Limbs fail closer to the trunk than out at the midpoint of the branch. One of the members of my staff published a paper in Journal of Arboriculture and Urban Forestry on the biomechanics of EAB-infested trees. They behave differently. There's greater risk associated to them. They're losing strength even at the point in time where you start to see woodpecker damage. They're already losing strength. You have to take a lot of extra care if you're to the point where the bark is sloughing off. when we think very practically from how do we work in these trees, how do we get rid of them, can we put people in these trees? There are significant and serious safety issues around this. We go out and we talk about this at industry events. We have to. You can think of it in terms of, with EAB, it's like saying a 3-inch diameter branch has the strength of a 1-inch diameter branch. It reduces the strength of that wood and they behave unpredictably. When you get to where you're a standing dead tree, there's a greater likelihood of failure at the base. So you go into native wooded areas, unmanaged areas, trees fall over. So if you're managing a population of trees and you have a lot of them and you get to the point where you have standing dead trees in a community, the risk factors go up. It's not to say they're all going to blow down in the next windstorm, but in terms of risk factors, those are going up as you get to this point in time. We've issued guidance within Davey related to this. We don't want our people climbing trees that are stone dead from emerald ash borer. The safety risks are too great. It's not worth us putting people in those kinds of trees when we can take them down a different way. So we talk about this because there is significant risk associated with this pest. If you got a lot of them, and you get a big backlog of them, how do you get them down? You want to be efficient, you want to be quick. You're probably going to need different type of equipment or different approach. It's challenging. It's not just business as usual. In terms of risk and liability, Fort Wayne, Indiana. I was on the phone earlier. I came in 2 minutes late because I was finishing up a conversation with Chad Tinkle, the city forester from Fort Wayne, Indiana. They started emerald ash borer with 16,000 municipal ash trees. They found it in about 2006, 2007, somewhere in there. By the year 2011, they had removed 3,700 ash trees in 2011. In 2012, his number actually, he told me, was about 4,500. And in 2013, they're basically done. They'll have removed about 2,500 ash trees this year. Their internal capacity to take trees down, when they devote all of their forestry resources to removing ash trees, they can take down about 1,200 trees a year. That's, you know, with their crews and their size and how many personnel they have. So they've had to outsource a lot of this work. And this is essentially all they've been able to do for the last 3 to 4 years. They don't respond to homeowner phone calls about trees on their property. They're not doing any sort of maintenance pruning within the city. Their replanting budgets have gone away because the lawyers have said, we had 12 lawsuits against the city because of EAB in 2012. They've had lawsuits against the city in 2013. Branches falling, bark sloughing off, property damage. Nobody's been killed, but the lawsuits and the risk and the liability factors are real. So his point, he said, if you have a replanting budget, a replacement budget, if it's not well protected or if it's not dedicated and it can only be used for this purpose, all of your resources, if you've got a lot of ash trees, at the worst of the worst, need to go into getting them down. You have backlogs. These trees are standing there dead. Mark's point, you know, you look for signs and symptoms, woodpecker damage. The epicormic sprouts, this is really interesting. You don't really think about it this way until you hear it from somebody who's gone through it. In Fort Wayne, they're backlogged so much that, you know, they have all these hundreds and thousands of standing dead trees waiting to come down, and they're getting them down as quickly as they can. But they sucker. And so they're having to send people out at intersections where there's ash going towards an intersection and they're suckering. There's a visibility issue. You can't see around the suckers. So they're going out and having to snip off suckers off dead trees for safety reasons. And you think, this is insane. These trees are going to come down. Why don't you just get those down first? Well, there's thousands of them that all need to come down. So you just can't do it all fast enough if you've got a lot of them and when it gets to this point in time on the curve. You know, they're somewhere up here, probably a little higher based on what Chad told me this morning. So the risk and the liability factor alone, if you're in a community, you're in a decision maker in a city, you got a lot of ash trees, be prepared. Those types of things are very, very real. Now let's shift gears. Again, we're in that conversation about why this is a problem we have to manage. And we've said scope, sheer numbers of them, risk, liability, that's another angle. There's another piece of this conversation as well, and it has to do with the benefit loss of these trees. And I'm not saying let's go out and treat them all and save them all. That's not the point. But the reality is, if we're talking about hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of trees in municipal areas, there is a significant and substantial and real benefit loss. I think emerald ash borer does a really nice job showcasing all the things that can go wrong with trees in the urban forest, right? It does a great job of illustrating liability, risk, cost, expense. All the negative side of it is on display when EAB comes into town. Now, if we only think about it that way, I think we're only doing half our job, because the reality is these trees provide real, quantifiable, fact-based benefits to people and society. We have to think of it. I think of it in terms of, you hear about liabilities, risks, all the negative side of it. Well, if you think on a balance sheet, when you have liabilities, there's got to be assets. So what are the assets these trees deliver? What does that look like? It's stormwater mitigation, carbon sequestration, property value, cooling effects, pollution mitigation. There's a laundry list of physical, economic, and social benefits that these trees also provide. When you take, in the city of Milwaukee, and you start talking about taking out 35,000 trees, and they're right on Lake Michigan, you start talking about the additional millions of gallons of stormwater that will now go through the pipes instead of into the trees. They start thinking in terms of, you got engineers saying, wait a second, what are you talking about? These trees suck up water out of the ground, and if they're gone, that water goes down my pipes, but we're already close to capacity. Well, what's going to happen when we lose 40,000 trees? You need more capacity, because that's what's going to happen. You're going to have more water going through the system. That's the reality of it. It's a different conversation. It reframes this from a bug and a tree, and gosh, isn't it too bad that the pretty trees are going to die, into this is going to cost us. This is a real engineering problem in some communities. It turns out in Milwaukee, David Sivier, they did an analysis. They did an inventory. That's how they knew they had 17% ash. They have an understanding of what benefits these trees provide. They are keenly aware of the water-related issues, being right on Lake Michigan. And so David Sivier was able to get funding for his forestry program and his EAB program out of a bucket of money related to water issues from the EPA. Different source of funding available when you frame this problem around water, not around trees. Interesting approach. Different way to think about it. So point is, we do need to talk about the benefits these trees provide. Inventories give us tremendously good information. And they should be really the starting point of many EAB management programs. Get to know how many ash trees you have in your community. It's a critical starting point. After all, how could you forecast your need? How could you forecast a budget? How could you forecast what impact this is going to have if you don't know how many you have? So an inventory is a really important piece of information. And they tell us really good things like how many, what kind, how big, what condition, and so on and so forth. You might represent what your urban forest looks like, on a chart that looks something like this. It's outstanding. It's what we need. Now, take it one step further. The benefit component of this, and I'm not going to dwell on this too long. I don't want to take anything from any people that might follow me speaking-wise. But this benefits-based approach, we can look at this and say, that inventory tells us what's the structure of our urban forest. What are the species? What's the size? What's the condition? It gives us that basic information. We can start to make management decisions from there. But run that data through something like iTree and have it tell us things related to stormwater and carbon and all these other benefits. And we start to say, all right, that captures what the environmental services these trees provide looks like. They're not just sitting there being decorations. They're doing things that are of value to the community. We can quantify that. It ultimately allows us to paint a picture of these trees that look and feel like this, deliver these services, and that has a value that looks like this, and now it's instead of just managing something, it's strategic management. So you can start to look at a data set. This is information that came out of Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. Down here, hard to read perhaps, they have 16% of their urban forest is ash. So they did an inventory, they ran that data through iTree, and it gives them economic numbers for the benefits related to stormwater or air quality or energy conservation, carbon sequestration, aesthetics. Mark referred to the human health side of it. Dr. Bill Sullivan at the University of Illinois does some incredibly interesting work with respect to the impact trees have on our well-being, the human end of it, the softer side of the science, recovery from illness, views of green spaces, connection with nature, reduce our stress levels. He's gone and done the medical testing to affirm that. So it's a really interesting world. It's a brand new set of words. It's a new vocabulary for us to talk. But again, back to the question previously, how do you get traction? How do you get people to do things? How do you take... Part of it, to me, is reframing some of it around the dollars and cents. This is, again, as much an economic issue as it is a tree issue in a community. So I like the idea of capturing what are the benefits these trees provide, and then how much are they reduced by when we lose these trees by EAB. The benefits the trees in your urban forest deliver, it's not like it's writing the city a check every year for $1 million. It's not quite that way. But at the same time, I think it's a good thing for us to reframe that these trees are more than just decorations in the community. They deliver these services that we can quantify and put numbers to. It only enhances our ability to communicate with more people in the right way, a way that they can actually hear. Finance people might not be thinking in terms of trees, but they're thinking in terms of dollars and cents. If we can speak a common language, it helps our cause a little more. Yeah.
Question. Having sat through many of these EAB talks, there's something that keeps popping up in my head. Every time that it's broken down by municipality. You never hear what DEC or any other environmental agency is, in the grand scope of things, what they're going to do. Again, I could save every tree in the city of Albany by treating it, but when you have how many millions of ash trees in New York State in undeveloped regions that aren't going to be treated, you're setting yourself up to get one hell of a chemically resistant bug, because it still has the good stands to feed on the Adirondacks, the Tug Hill Plateau, the Catskills, that have never been poisoned. And it goes and it every once in a while eats off the poison tree. You didn't kill it, you just made it that much more harder to kill.
Couple points. So you had 2 points in there. The first one, you've stolen a little thunder out of my talk from about 10 slides further down the path. Okay. There's no, you're absolutely right. We could go to any state in the union, and there isn't a, for one, there's no national strategy for how to deal with EAB. You're not going to hear it from EPA, you're not going to hear it from USDA Forest Service, you're not going to hear, if you're looking somewhere up there for what to do for EAB, it doesn't exist. It varies by state, by county, by city, by individual. There is no single national plan out there. Asian longhorn beetle is different. That's one, federally mandated. Here's the program. Here's the way we handle that particular pest. Like it or not, whatever you think about it, that's not the point. The point is EAB, they tried that. 2002, 2003, 2004, eradication, clear-cutting zones, tried to manage it like Asian longhorn beetle. It didn't work. The horse is out of the barn, you're on your own. So you decide, and that's why you'll hear these things. There's no right approach necessarily. I think there's pros and cons, and that's what I'll talk about with some of the examples. So on the one hand, it will vary greatly. I can give you examples, and I will. In Chicago, one community is going to cut down 13,000 trees. The neighboring community is going to preserve 16,000. Who's right? They make individual decisions based on the politics, the money, the budget, and so on and so forth. So that's one piece of it. The other end of it, on the point of resistance, there are billions of ash trees out there, and the number that are going to get treated is minuscule in the big picture. I mean, we're talking about if there's something like 8 billion ash trees in the US, the total number of trees that are going to get treated is probably under 1 million. Maybe it's in the 1 million range. So it's a percent.
And our New York canopy is how many million?
Yeah, 700, 800, 900 million.
Yeah.
All the way around. You're not, yeah. So the idea of accumulating resistance when so few trees are actually going to get treated, I'm not an entomologist, my background isn't there, but I just don't think we're setting ourselves up for a tremendous amount of fear. And you know, Mark's giving me the okay or the thumbs up that we're just probably not going to see resistance take place. For one, this is going to move through areas so quickly, relatively speaking. When you start thinking about how it's going to move and so on and so forth, I mean, it's just so few trees get treated. If you elected to treat all the trees in a community, like some communities are choosing to do, you know, the idea of resistance forming or accumulating, I tend not to worry too much about. I think the concerns about treatments are valid, and wise use of pesticides is an incredibly valid concern. Pollinator issues are very valid concerns, but in the grand scheme of things, what's actually going to get treated is a tiny, tiny proportion of all the trees out there. So I'm not arguing with you on any front. You're right on both fronts. I mean, it's just that the resistance piece probably won't come to fruition just because we're not treating all the ash.
Well, again, it's swatting a fly with an atomic bomb, but I'm just curious if there's been any studies. We all know that this bug emerges after so many degree days. Mm-hmm. Why are we not doing, you know, again, pollinators, everything else that we would lose if we did it, but we're gonna lose those anyways if we lose all these trees.
And that's where it comes down to, and this is where I'll continue on. You know, I can sense there's frustration, and it's that way everywhere. All states that are dealing with this right now, all communities in these states, people are looking around for leadership on this front. And the reality of it is, very, very few places have an umbrella program saying, here's how to do it. That information isn't out there very well. It's really, you're on your own. You come up to speed, you figure it out, you decide what resources you have, how many trees you have, you write a management plan, and if it works for you, it's a good program. It might not work for those guys down the road. I'll revisit this. I'll continue to try to frame it around your question and concern, because it's a perfectly legitimate one. Last piece on this, benefits. Again, you get to the point where we can say, these trees do have value beyond just the structural value. They deliver annual benefits. They do provide habitat for wildlife. They are a place for, you know, things to reside and places, you know, where shade is created and stormwater is sucked up instead of going through the pipes. That's what iTree does. So as you go forward and you develop an inventory, run that through iTree. It's a free set of software. It's a suite out there. You can go and run it through it yourself, and you can come up with this kind of information. City of Milwaukee took out a billboard. Milwaukee's street trees provide a $900,000 annual cooling benefit. City doesn't have to spend $900,000 a year because of shade from trees. You can quantify those kinds of things and reframe this conversation. It allows us to take it much further than a tree issue, okay? So that's what I wanted to say about that. And then finally, the economics. Again, where we're at in my portion of this talk is, you know, why we have to manage this problem. Why can't we just sort of go about our business and deal with it as it comes? And we said scope, and we said liability, and then we said benefit loss, and then lastly, economics. Because of the scope of the problem in many places, it's an economic issue. Madison, Wisconsin expects to spend $4 million fighting EAB in the coming years. That's a quote from the newspaper 2 weeks ago. It's a town in the Midwest with 240,000 people. I don't know how many ash trees they have, but I can assure you, $4 million in the big picture of what their forestry budget looks like, it's probably 5 to 10-fold their annual forestry budget. So they're expecting a huge boost in spending that's going to happen. So here's what EAB does. If you're a budget manager, anybody in here control a budget or finance manager, you know, here's what a forestry budget typically looks like. You know, maybe it goes down a little bit, I don't know, up or down. Here's what EAB does to it. So your goal as a person who's managing a population of trees and you've got this pest coming at you, again, back to the idea of flattening off that curve, and there's various techniques to do that. But if you do nothing, what happens is you'll run into a period of time where communities who have elected to do nothing are finding they're spending 2, 3, 4 times their annual forestry budget on EAB for several years in a row to get through the worst of the worst. That's Fort Wayne's example. So the economics of this become front and center as much as anything else. Okay, so what do we do with all this? What are people doing about all of this? How do we manage this particular problem? Well, for one, see where you hijacked me here. It's all right. was a good lead-in. I'll give you that $20 bill later on for setting the course. There's no right way to manage it. There's no federally dictated, there's no state dictated oftentimes. There's just no right way to do it. There's no national program. It just doesn't exist. There are guidelines, there's quarantines, there's things, but there isn't anything that sews it all together that says, well, here's the status of what we know, and here's what you should do with it. There are, however, 3 what I call cornerstone documents out there in this industry relevant to emerald ash borer. It's the Society of Municipal Arborists position paper. I think one of the speakers after lunch is going to elaborate on this particular one. It's a cornerstone document that says some things about what are the components of emerald ash borer management. What do you have to be paying attention to if you're a population manager? There is the EAB treatment consensus document. This is basically a one-pager that says treatments work. Now that might not sound very dramatic and that might seem like old news, but in 2002, we didn't know if treatments worked. Every treatment out there was an experiment. We just didn't know. It took time to do the research, the peer-reviewed, publishable quality, where you've got control trees that die and treated trees that survive. That level of research takes time. So you get into 2006, 2007, 2008, when this bug is landing in places like Chicago, and the question about do treatments work was still out there. So a group of about 20 people or so, academics, researchers, nonprofits, private companies, put together a document that simply says, if you follow the procedures laid out by peer-reviewed research, treatments are effective and they can be part of your management program. To sit here today and either already have known that or to hear that and believe that puts you so much further ahead of people who have come before us. It wasn't this way in Michigan. It wasn't this way in Fort Wayne. It wasn't this way in Chicago at the beginning of EAB there. So we're ahead, on the frontier of where EAB is at. And then this multi-state treatment fact sheet. This is essentially the thing that says it's 5 or 6 different universities that have said these are the procedures, these are the treatments that are effective. So here are the components of what to manage. Treatments work, and here are the ones that have had the research done around them. Stick with these, follow those procedures, and you'll be in better shape than if you're off on your own running your own experiments. So that SMA position paper basically says these are the components of EAB management programs. I'm not going to elaborate on those. You can read them for yourself up there. There's a variety of them. I will dwell briefly on this concept of treatments because it historically has been the most contentious or questionable issue out there in all of this. And at the same time, treatments are probably the single thing that you can do to flatten that curve out. There's really, at the present time, because we don't have the biologicals, we don't have the parasites, we don't have those other biological control agents, treatments are the one thing that can help you spread the costs out. So again, what we do is we reference again this predictable pattern of losses. This is how the population of ash trees will die over a period of time, a 3 to 5 year window where 2/3 to 3/4 of those trees die. I say this is down here at this part of the curve, it's the trap. It's the EAB trap, lulled into the false sense of security. We've had it for 4 years, we've had it for 5 years. It's not so bad. It's probably going to be different here. I don't think that way. It hasn't ever been that way yet. Maybe you'll be different, but it hasn't been that way anywhere else. So watch out for that trap. You can literally go across the country and put different cities on the curve. Where are you at? Yeah, you know, Detroit and Toledo, it's pretty much over. Fort Wayne, my friend Chad up there, finishing off the last 2,500 removals. Chicagoland is so big, there's a range of pressure there. Where I live, we're right here. We're still in the mousetrap years. And then there's a slew of other places that have either yet to find it or just found it or they've had it for 1 or 2 or 3 years and it doesn't seem so bad. Your management options, what you can actually do, are inversely related to where you're at on that curve. The further along that curve you go, the fewer the management options you have available. All Chad can do out here is take trees down as fast as possible. He's hoping he doesn't have a storm. He's hoping he doesn't have a major issue with any other species of trees. He's just cutting them down as fast as he can. But if you're down here, lower on the curve, you can do an inventory, an assessment. You can look for different places where there might be funding or money. You can get some trees out of the way. You can treat some trees. You have choices. You have more options available to you. Different things can happen at different periods of time on that curve. When you're down here, education of elected officials, citizens, decision makers, inventories and management plans are best done down here. If you're going to treat trees, that's a good time to get started. It's always best to get started on the treatment side of things when the pressure is lower. You get out here, continue your treatments. You're going to be doing removals. You might be using treatments to stage removals. And then out here at the latter phases of EAB, any remnant treatments that you want to continue to do to save those trees or carry certain trees through, you'll continue. And then you're going to be doing your removals and then hopefully replacements. Just different things you can be doing at different times if you think about it this way. So what about these treatment options? I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. I'm going to kind of skim through a couple slides, but I just want to reaffirm these things work. They're effective. What are the options? Mark already said this. It's as though we coordinated this ahead of time. Imidacloprid, dinotephuron, emamectin, benzoate. The whole point is these are the ones that have the most proof. These are the ones with the peer-reviewed research. These are the ones that have been studied and tested. Do they work? Yes, they work. Can they fail? Of course. I don't know of any treatment of any kind out there that's 100% effective. So it's not to say that these are miracles, but they are effective, especially if you use them following the approved methods. This is imidacloprid. Different doses have been worked out, time of year. The bottom line is, and I'll just walk you through a couple key points, in Dan Herm's trial from Ohio State, started it in 2006. All the trees were of the same canopy thinning. They were all healthy trees. His control trees all died. That's what you want in a research experiment like this. You need your control trees to die from emerald ash borer, and they did. And doesn't that curve look sort of familiar to us? And there were imidacloprid treatments that have carried those trees through all of that EAB pressure. They started early and they stayed the course. Imidacloprid works. Dinotephuron, the bark spray, Mark referred to it, same way. Untreated trees, these all were treated annually, starting in 2008, evaluated in 2012. Untreated trees, they're on the road to death. They're 60% canopy thinning. Treatments are all holding up well. And then, of course, triage, emamectin benzoate. This is the one Mark referred to as regarded as the strongest one out there. I would agree with that. Here we go. This trial basically said, let's treat them and see how long the treatment lasts. We know it works very well, and this is some of the data that says you can get a third season of performance out of some of these treatments. The bottom line and the takeaway message, not to dwell on all the details on the slide, but it's that there are options. That's a good thing. It's a very good thing. So when do people generally consider treating trees? Mature trees, prominent locations, historical value, places where it would be very difficult to remove that tree or very expensive to remove that tree. You can probably think of a number of those kinds of places yourself. The key takeaway messages on this, and I want to get to my handful of final specific examples for you. For treatments, though, focus on protecting healthy trees. Yeah, you're going to have to continue the course. If you want to keep that tree around, the expectation right now is you'll have to keep treating it. The hope is the intensity with which you manage this problem can go down as the wave of pressure has gone through. That's the hope, but we don't know the final outcome of that yet. We also know infested trees get brittle, they decline, and they present safety risks. So, generally speaking, prevention, if you're going to save trees, get started early and stay the course. Don't go after trees that are half dead and try to rescue them with a miracle cure. Your success rate won't be as high. And lastly, last couple of thoughts to leave you with here with respect to case studies, approaches. What are people actually doing out there? Mark hit on this. There are several approaches out there that you could observe. Do nothing. Try to keep up with the removals. There's pros and cons. Proactively cut them all down. You could do that. It's cheaper and faster and simpler at times to cut down healthy trees. You don't have those same brittle safety risks. So there are schools of thought about get rid of some of these things ahead of time. It's not a bad approach necessarily. Using treatments to stage removals. The idea that treating a tree is a lot less expensive than cutting it down and replacing it. So spend a little now to push the need, get into another budget cycle. Use treatments to get yourself into more budget cycles down the road. And then another one, lastly, preservation. So here we go. The do-nothing approach. We could look back in time and say Detroit did nothing. They didn't know. They were the guinea pigs in all of this. It's not their fault. I don't mean that to be negative to Detroit. They just didn't know what hit them. Urbana, Illinois. They've only got about 400 ash trees. They know that they have 400 ash trees. Think about that. They have an inventory. That's good. But they could do nothing and just run it out, and they'll be okay because the scope of the problem for them is sufficiently small. They don't have to have a big plan around it. So they could legitimately do nothing there. Tinley Park, Illinois, is a community on the south side of Chicago that didn't have a forester. They just didn't have a forester on staff. So as a result of that, they didn't have a lot of awareness about emerald ash borer, and so they've effectively done nothing. They're to the point now, they had 10,000 ash trees in the city. They did an inventory, too late in the game to do much more than just get a count of this. And they've just put out a tender for taking down 8,000 trees. They're all infested, they're all gone. They're spending several $1 million on the removal and replacement. So they didn't have to spend or pay anything up to a certain point in time. Now they've got to spend a lot of money today to get rid of the problem and to avoid the risk and the liability issues that come with standing dead trees. In terms of proactive removals, Wheaton, Illinois is looking at, this is very recent information, they have 5,500 ash trees, and they're basically saying, we're going to cut down all of them and spend $3 million plus to do so by 2017. They have some high pressure in that area, and it's sort of a hybrid approach between proactive removals and do nothing. They haven't really done a lot to this point. So they've had to take some trees down. But again, you're talking about thousands of trees, millions of dollars. Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I live, the city has about 40,000 ash trees, and they're on an 8-year plan to remove them. We're 5 years into EAB. My question for the city of Minneapolis is the bug going to observe your 8-year timeline? We're getting close to the uptick on that curve, so you might be losing them faster than you plan to cut them down. Maybe we should have started earlier. Maybe we can still nudge this program into something that also includes treating some trees and staging their removal to a later date. This idea, and I know there's going to be a lot of little small text up here. I won't necessarily expect you to read through it all, but I'm happy to walk through it. Milwaukee's probably done the best job of staging removals. They have 33,000 ash trees in the city. They're essentially treating all of them with the intention of phasing them out over a 20-year period of time. So they're going with triage. They're going every other year with half the population, and they're going to phase them out. And basically, they're saying we're preventing the catastrophic event of losing 17% of our urban forest canopy in a very short window of time. That would be crippling to them. They go on to say that these injections, while they have to spend the money now, allows them to maintain their other forestry services. They won't have to devote all of their time and resources to cutting down ash trees because they're planning this out. The only problem in talking with their city forester with this approach is that the treatments are so effective that they don't have dying trees, and so they're still cutting down healthy trees, and that's usually gets the phone to ring when you're cutting down green, healthy trees. People tend to react negatively to that. A couple other examples. I'm on my last 2 slides. Schaumburg, Illinois, they've elected to preserve 700 high-value trees. 700 in the city, key locations, prominent locations. They want to keep them. They're treating 5,400 trees to stage the removals over a longer period of years. So spend a little bit now, delay the need to cut some of these trees down for multiple years, get into more budget cycles. They're in a 5-year phase-out that's planned. Elgin, Illinois, similar, 6,900 public ash trees. It's 15% of their canopy. They want to keep a couple thousand. They've taken 1,400 out, and they're going to phase out 3,500 at 500 trees a year. They're using treatments to help stage those removals. And lastly, preservation, just down the road, Naperville, Illinois. Their intention, they've removed a couple thousand trees. They had 16,000 to start with, heavy pressure, and they calculated removal and replacement of all of these for them in their community would be something like $10+ million. 14 was their number. They're on a 6-year treatment plan that's going to cost them a lot less. And if you think about this, this is going to, for the same amount of money as it would cost to cut them all down, they're going to be essentially 20 years out to get to the same dollars and cents. They're going to buy themselves time. Maybe technology changes. Maybe something else happens. Maybe we get more effective treatments that last longer. They're buying themselves time. So the takeaway messages here, from my perspective, are we know this is a pest of historical significance. It's right up there already with the worst of the worst urban forestry pests we've seen. It's going to take time, energy, and money, regardless of what option you elect to use. The industry is pretty well aligned around selective removals, inventory and assessment tools, treatments to protect trees, and treatments to stage removals to a later date. And we also know that our knowledge is evolving, so we have to stay current. The good news is, and again, there is good news, you're so much further ahead than the poor folks off to the west who had to go through this and figure all these things out. I like to conclude with, at one point in time, the brightest minds on the planet thought the earth was flat. That's just the way they thought of it. They were the smartest people around, and we thought the earth was flat. We've learned it's not. So the same will be the case with respect to emerald ash borer. What we know today, what we've learned, what we think we know, will change. 2 years from now, 5 years from now, this will look different. Stay current, stay connected to this kind of information. So with that, I'm done.